Before I start the video, as a quick reminder, check out my links down below to help support the channel. I am now in partnership with Baron of Dice. They have some awesome TCG accessories like playmats, deck boxes, and dice. And if you want to level up your setup, it is the perfect way to do so. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some sweet perks, consider joining the Patreon. If you want to get early access to videos or even some deck help, Patreon is where it's at. And so without further ado, let's get back into the video. Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin with Jurassic Magic, and in today's video I wanted to go over a pretty powerful commander that was recently spoiled from the new Avatar Last Airbender set, and that's Toph. And I gotta say, overall, she looks extremely strong. Of course, as she said,
I am the greatest earthbender in the world.
So she's the greatest earthbender in her universe, and now in the Magic the Gathering universe at your commander tables. She's also going to be the greatest artifact sacrificing, land recurring, value generating nightmare that you've probably ever seen. Toph doesn't just bend metal and earth, she now weaponizes it on the battlefield against your opponents. And then she could easily rebuild all those lands and then repeat it and do it all over again. So in today's video, we're going to be building around Toph, not so much as a deck tech, but more brewing around some ideas around her. I'm going to focus on a little bit of a landfall theme. Of course, she's focusing on lands, animate them into creatures, and of course that's really any artifact on the battlefield as long as it's a non-token. But hopefully to you, it will be as flavorful enough that your opponents will know that they just got beaten by the Blind Bandit. And so with that said, let's get it started and building around Toph. So Toph has two big tricks. First, she's going to turn all your non-token artifacts into lands. That means mana rocks, value engines, even creature artifacts as long as they're non-token. They are now lands. Unfortunately, they won't tap for mana unless you have some other synergies that I'll talk about later. This is going to open up an entire new world for sacrifice synergies in a Naya-based landfall deck. So she has that going for her. Also, that second ability, Earthbend 2, animating a land, putting 2/1/1 counters on it, and basically makes it immortal, because when it dies or get exiled, it just comes right back tapped. So what this means is that we could feed our lands to the wood chipper for value, and they'll just keep coming back like an indestructible supply of middle fingers. Think of a fetch land, for example. If you turn it from the Earthbending 2 into a land that's a creature, when you sacrifice it, that fetch land will just re-enter the battlefield tapped, giving you a lot of value overall. So first, I wanted to talk about just generic Landfall Staples, cards that'll help benefit us along the way. I like cards like Tireless Provisioner and Lotus Cobra. Whenever you put a land on the battlefield, you get a mana, whether it's in the form of treasure or mana floating in the air. But not only that, whenever you're playing those mana rocks or those other non-token artifacts, those count for landfall too for extra value, and that way you can get more mana on top of that. Another similar card to that would be Nissa Resurgent Animus. This is great because it has that Lotus Cobra ability. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you add 1 mana of any color. But of course, if it's the second time this ability has resolved, you reveal the top card of your library until you reveal an elf or elemental card. Put that card into your hand and the rest of the bottom of your library in a random order. Another landfall card I wanted to highlight would be Tanuk Memorial Ensign. This is great because whenever a land you control enters, Tanuk deals 1 damage to each opponent, so every artifact that's entering the battlefield, that as long as it's non-token, will trigger Tanuk to deal 1 damage, and if it resolved the second time, you get to draw a card too, so that's another added bonus. And before I move on to the next section, let's talk about Ice-Till Explorer. This is a crazy and cracked card in this type of deck. Playing additional lands during your turn and playing lands from your graveyard at Crucible Worlds with an Exploration stapled onto 1 is quite powerful. Of course, it has that landfall ability. Whenever a land you control enters, you mill a card. This might seem like a downside in this type of deck, however, it can be a bonus if we have a lot of regrowth effects. Another interesting part about this deck is the fact that we want to be sacrificing our lands that got animated by Toph so that they can re-enter the battlefield, and of course that does apply for artifacts, so we want to have a lot of ways to sacrifice those lands. A card like Zurian Orb can help us sacrifice a land and gain 2 life. Sylvan Safekeeper is another example of protecting our commander by sacrificing a land, giving it Shroud. Another card that will sacrifice our lands would be Lotus Field. When it enters, you sacrifice 2 lands, and if those lands were animated by Toph, they could just re-enter the battlefield again, and then we just have a land that has hexproof and adding 3 mana of 1 color. This is extremely powerful. And if you want to be truly mean, you could include a card like Strip Mine that you could sacrifice to destroy target land. You can actually destroy your own target lands if you really wanted to get that extra value, but of course a lot of other people will consider sacrificing this to destroy another target land that an opponent controls, reducing their lands down to nothing. Another card that works very well in this type of deck is Scapeshift. You can sacrifice all lands you control, then search your library for that much lands. The only downside to this card is the price of it, but you kind of get the point. When you sacrifice your lands, you're going to get some added benefits. But again, there is a big downside for your non-token artifacts being lands, and that's the fact that they can't tap for mana. You could utilize some cards like Joiner Adept. Lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color into your mana pool. The same can be applied for Dune Chanter. It will also have the additional type of Desert, and lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. So this could be extra useful in situations of getting extra mana. Ashaya is another big example. Even though technically it'll make all your creatures into lands anyways, that could be useful in some situations. Dryad of the Elysian Grove. Lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other type, and it also has the added bonus of playing an additional land per turn. And there's also Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, as well as Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, and a lot of people are thinking, wait a minute, Urborg? That makes each lands into swamps. Shouldn't that be technically a black card and not allowed in a Toph EDH deck? Well, the fact that it doesn't have a swamp mana symbol means that it could go into any deck you want. So Yavimaya and Urborg can make all your lands, including the ones you animated that were artifacts, tap for those color of mana. Another card that works with lands entering the battlefield, because most of them are going to enter tapped, would be Tiller Engine. This is a very good card in this type of deck. Whenever a land enters the battlefield tapped under your control, you choose one, untap that land, or you have the other option, tap target non-land permanent and opponent controls. I mainly like this because with Toph's ability, if one of our creatures that were lands dies, we can return to the battlefield tapped. With this on the battlefield, it will return untapped. So now that I've talked about landfall synergies along with making sure our lands can tap for mana, I want to move on to another subject, and that subject is taking advantage of all the permanents we have on the battlefield that will be lands in addition to their other types. A prime example of that would be Hour of Revelation or even Ondu Inversion, destroying all non-land permanents. Luckily for us, with our commander and a little bit of synergies, most of our permanents on the battlefield that are non-token artifacts will not be destroyed. Of course, in situations Toph might be destroyed, unless you have a card like Mycosynth Lattice on the battlefield. All your permanents on the battlefield, including your opponent's permanents, are going to be artifacts in addition to their other types. So all the enchantments, the planeswalkers, you name it, are going to be artifacts, and when we cast one of those spells, we won't have to worry about any of our stuff getting blown up, and all the while opponents' creatures and permanents will get blown up too. Also, I gotta say, Toph is nice tech against Cyclonic Rift because they're returning all non-land permanents, and since all our permanents are going to be lands, Cyclonic Rift is not going to affect us whatsoever, unless they bounce Toph and then everything else is going to be bounced too. I also want to double up on Toph's ability. Since it's only at the beginning of your end step, why not double that up with Annie Joins Up or even Gandalf the Grey? If a triggered ability of a legendary creature you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time with Annie Joins Up. And with Gandalf the White, this is extremely deadly in this type of deck because we're playing a lot of artifacts. We cast them as though they had flash, and if a legendary permanent or an artifact entering or leaving the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And look, this is going to be very powerful, not just for doubling up the triggers for Toph, but it could also double the triggers and death triggers of each legend and each artifact we control. So if there's any card to consider, it would be this one in this type of deck. I honestly think Gandalf is super underrated. Definitely should be in way more decks than we realize. Of course, you could also throw in Roaming Throne and give it to Toph. Most likely, I would say Warrior might be the best option to choose as far as a creature type, or maybe even ally, or even human. It depends on how you build your deck for sure. Another card that could work quite well in this type of deck is Traveling Chocobo. If a land or bird you control entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time, and all our artifacts are going to enter as lands with Toph on the battlefield, so we'll get some extra utilization if they have some great ETBs. But now I wanted to focus on the good stuff. What are the best artifacts we could take advantage of in this type of deck? One I personally like is the Great Henge. We are also going to get a reskin of this version for Avatar. However, when the Great Henge enters the battlefield, it'll be a land in addition to its other types, and it'll have all those abilities. People constantly trying to remove the Great Henge will be fooled when we put it into the battlefield as a creature with Toph, because it'll just re-enter constantly. Another card that's going to be busted in this type of deck would be Unwinding Clock, because remember, if those lands die, they re-enter the battlefield, and they will re-enter the battlefield tapped. With Unwinding Clock, they'll just untap during each other's player's untap step. And the next two have been talked about by other people. They're a little bit more of a degenerate playstyle that I don't necessarily care for, but I'm going to mention them for the sake of mentioning them. You could use Mindslaver or Gonti's Aetherheart, make them into creatures, take opponent's turns. Because you sacrifice it, you return it back to the battlefield. If it was a creature with Toph, same could be applied for Gonti, make it into a creature, and if you have enough energy, take that extra turn. And of course, because you're playing a lot of artifacts, most likely you'll have the energy for it. So Gonti's Aetherheart is a way to get infinite turns, and Mindslaver is to basically take control of a player's turn forever unless they deal with Mindslaver. So yeah, I didn't want to mention those too much, but obviously had to mention them with the synergy with Toph. But because a lot of lands are entering and leaving the battlefield and then returning again, a lot of landfall payoffs can be great. Again, I'm going to go back to these landfall payoffs. However, these can be game closers like Greensleeves, Morrow Sorcerer, Omnath, Locust of Rage, because they simply make tokens on the battlefield whenever a land enters the battlefield. Of course, you could also include Titania, Protector of Argoth. When those lands leave the battlefield, you get to make a 5/3 elemental creature token. So with all the token generation, you could easily overwhelm your opponents and close out the game. But if there was one card you should add into this deck, it would be easily Treasure Nabber. Whenever an opponent taps an artifact for mana, gain control of that artifact until end of turn. This paired with Mycosynth Lattice is very, and I mean very, scary for your opponents because all their lands are going to be artifacts, and because they tap them for mana, Treasure Nabber will gain control of them. And of course, if you have a lot of sacrifice outlets for lands or even artifacts, it almost in a way counts for land destruction, which is obviously frowned upon in Commander, because when they tap those lands, you can gain control of them and then sacrifice them. It is super mean, super degenerate. This kind of holds your opponents hostage, and Treasure Nabber or even Mycosynth Lattice will be a removal target. So with that said, that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video built around Toph, the First Metalbender. Of course, there's a lot of other cards and synergies that I didn't talk about. I just wanted to talk about my own personal thoughts and some cards that would be great with Toph. Let me know down below in the comments, what do you think of her, and do you plan on building her yourself? Also, is there any cards that I did miss? Let me know down below in the comments too. So if you can, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.